Roosevelt's choice of the two key officers responsible for finalising and implementing the War Plan Orange segment of Rainbow Five has been debated by historians almost as much as it has been lamented by Americans as a whole. It is not difficult to argue that the self-proclaimed military genius MacArthur's mouth earned in the hot seat, but the much maligned Admiral Husband E. Kimmel is a different story. War Plan Orange actively sought a big gun confrontation, and Kimmel was a big gun admiral, having served on a dozen battle wagons in his career. Though he lacked experience with naval aviation, carriers constituted a virtually untried arm of the United States Navy at that time. Without doubt, Kimmel was a consensus choice to implement War Plan Orange. Even General George Marshall wholeheartedly supported the aggressive Kimmel for the role. In early November 1941, Kimmel held a conference for his top officers at Pearl. There he presented the plan which would be implemented, as it happened, the following month. In the Philippines, MacArthur recently reinforced by 50 P-40 fighters and 24 B-17 bombers would fight a delaying action, preserving Manila Bay as a primary fleet anchorage. A British fleet of a battleship, battlecruiser and a carrier and screening elements would similarly defend Singapore, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, as also a secondary base for the American fleet. Southward, the Abda flotilla, a small American, British, Dutch, Australian force built around two heavy cruisers, would be reinforced by the carrier Yorktown. It would secure a secondary supply route to the Philippines from Australia, distracting Japanese naval forces in the process. Task Force 1, 11 battleships, 3 cruisers and 18 destroyers under the tactical command of Kimmel aboard the battleship Pennsylvania would sail on M+2 to Wake Island via Midway, arriving on M+12. In case Wake had fallen, a battalion of Marines in APDs, all destroyers modified as high-speed transport, accompanied Task Force 1. A convoy transporting a coastal defence battalion, 50 crated aircraft and supplies for Wake trailed Task Force 1 by approximately 5 days. Task Force 1 would sail from Wake for Guam by N+15. Guam, probably lost to the Japanese in the first days of the conflict, would be briefly bombarded and recaptured by the Marines. On or about N+21, the fleet would leave Guam for Manila, arriving off the Philippines no later than N+25 and taking a northern route around Luzon, hopefully forcing the Imperial Japanese Navy to give battle or face the interdiction of its forces engaged in the invasion of the Philippines. Elements of the victorious Task Force 1 would arrive in Manila by N+28 at the latest. Task Forces 2 and 3, centred respectively on the carriers USS Lexington and the USS Saratoga, would sortie from Pearl immediately upon the opening of hostilities. The carrier groups, each protected by a screen of cruisers and destroyers, would scout ahead of the fleet. Task Force 2 to the north, Task Force 3 to the south. Through M+15, the task forces would operate approximately 300 miles forward of Task Force 1. After the release or recapture of Guam, the carriers would be reined in to 50 miles, allowing them to fly CAP, Combat Air Patrol, over Task Force 1 as Japanese naval and land-based aircraft became more of a threat. Task Force 4 composed the carriers USS Enterprise and the fast battleships USS North Carolina and the USS Washington. The last named warship, rushed to commissioning as the Japanese threat loomed, would provide a diversionary force from either Pearl or its normal cruising station southeast of the Marshalls. TF-4 would raid through the Japanese mandates its high-speed run concluding with a daring assault on Truk, the major Imperial Japanese base in the area. Task Force 4 would then rendezvous with Task Force 1 near the Philippines around M+22. On M+30, a large convoy with men and material for Guam, Wake and the Philippines would leave the west coast. Task Force 5, composed of cruisers and destroyers, would escort this force to the Philippines if the Japanese had not yet sued for peace. The Japanese will face us because they must face us or abandon their invasion forces in the Pacific, and their battle line cannot stand against us, Kimmel stated at the conclusion of the briefing. He was interrupted by the man who would command Task Force 4, William F. Bullhalsey. "Be careful what you wish for, Admiral." Ordered by Kimmel to explain his outburst, the unrepentant Halsey warned, "Somewhere across that water, a little yellow bastard is telling other little yellow bastards the same thing, only he's saying that our battleships cannot stand against their carriers, and until those carriers are burning, I say be damn careful what you wish for." As it turned out, both men were correct to some degree. At 0800 December 7th, an aide awakened Kimmel at his office in Oahu with the news that Japan had just invaded the Philippines. He immediately ordered War Plan Orange to be implemented and prepared to board the Arizona rather than the Pennsylvania. Kimmel had placed the usual flagship of the Pacific Fleet in dry dock only 3 days earlier for annual servicing of its shafts, and rather than sail late, the Admiral ordered it to join the M+30 convoy as reinforcement for his by then theoretically victorious fleet. An hour later, Kimmel's blood pressure soared when he learned that Douglas MacArthur had somehow managed to be taken by surprise. Most of his planes had been destroyed on the ground, and the Imperial Army had landed at points across the Philippines with minimal resistance. Turning to Ensign Elmo R. Budzonwalt, his newly appointed aide, Kimmel snarled, "If MacArthur loses my base before I get there, he'd better have died gloriously, or I will kill him myself." As the American fleet began its exodus from Pearl, a last telegram crossed the Pacific to Tokyo. It read, "Hope to leave for Tokyo tomorrow. Plan to climb Mount Nitaka next week." Unknown to the American telegraphist, the sender, Takeo Yoshikawa, had been carefully observing the American base for 6 months. His telegram, received at the American desk of Japanese Naval Intelligence and forwarded immediately to Yamato, gave rise to cheers among Yamamoto's staff. Their admiral, an avid climber, had picked the phrase, "Climb Mount Nitaka," as the signal that the American battle fleet had entered the fray.